thank you very much, Andrew. That was great. Now I'm going to pass over to Dr. Moyo on my right here, who is Nkosano, beg your pardon, who has had a very distinguished career in both private and public sector in his native Zimbabwe and elsewhere, and has most recently just completed a post as Vice President and Chief Operating Officer at the African Development Bank, and is now Executive Chairman of the Mandela Institute for Development Studies. We're delighted you're here. There's a gizmo if you need it. And please, over to you.
Thank you. Before I make my comments, I just would like to make two health warnings, if I may. The first one is just an admission that the journey I've traveled has left me heavily jaundiced. I see things through an African perspective because I care a lot about Africa, clearly, and my experience by and large has been within that context. The second one is that when the North African Revolution started happening, I was actually in Tunis, and I stayed in Tunis right through that process. I've just landed this morning from Dubai, where a professor made a comment which I thought was interesting and relevant to what I'm going to tell you. He said to me, you know, between Bill Gates and I, our average net worth is 18 billion. And the relevance of this is that the North African Revolution told us that our statistics often don't mean very much. And for me, when I listen to people talking about Africa, like the development efforts in the last decade, there is very good numbers that get quoted. When I travel through Africa, there is no evidence of that on the ground. So I've got a problem with statistics, okay? Those are my two warnings. In terms of what I would like to quickly talk about in framing our conversation later on, I just want to look at what I've called the different facets of aid. In fact, I think that's an old slide. I'm not sure whether they loaded the one I brought this morning.
Okay. Did we have one from this morning? We may have another slide somewhere.
Was the presentation I brought loaded? Because I've changed the way, I mean, I've called it development rather than aid as such.
Is that the only one we've got?
Yeah. But in terms of materially, there won't be much difference. So the nation state is an anachronism, mismatch between some of the big challenges that we're facing today and the governance structures or institutional frameworks that we're trying to use. Then this whole issue of global versus national accountability, resources and sustainability, and all the new donors which have already been mentioned, or development partners. I think they... that means it was not loaded. Well, it was taken by somebody, one of the team. Or gave it back to me. So maybe if we could just load this then. Okay. Sorry about that.
Can I ask in the interagnum whether people are feeling too warm, cold? Because I know these things, we all get a little bit hot. How's the temperature? Not too bad. Okay. Great, because we have this very fancy heating cooling system in ODI now, and it's meant to take note of how warm you're feeling, and it will cool everybody down. But I'm not so sure.
Yeah, that's the one. That is the one.
So it should be up.
Okay, that's better.
Terrific. Sorry about that.
That's no problem. Well, let's just go to the... I've got this, yeah? Where is the pickup signal, or is it not yet?
He's just going to put it in. There you go. You should be able to do it now.
Oh, there we are. Okay.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you. So that's the latest version. So different facets of development financing, the old puzzles and new pieces, as we've already been told, resources and sustainability, the mismatch I've alluded to. So let's just move on because I've already covered this. The importance of this slide for me is that, again, we talk about the force field, if you like. What forces are at play? What elements are we having to address as we move forward? And you'll notice as you look at that slide that some of these things are like playing a game of chess. So the development partners who might, for instance, be interested in using development interventions as foreign policy instruments will not tell you exactly what it is they want to do. So you are left guessing and playing a game of chess. And I think human rights is coming to the fore already, as opposed to will come to the fore. It's already, I think, coming to the fore in terms of these interactions. Trade, no free lunch. Again, I think, in my opinion, the fact that at the moment we've accepted an economic model which is based on capitalism, underlying it as a fundamental is that competition is the rule of the game. And therefore, when you say you're being given something, often it's just you're not aware what you're being asked to pay back. And already we've heard about the issue of funding global public goods, which again I'll come back to in a minute. Resources and sustainability and implications. We are all aware of what's going on in Europe and the implications of that in terms of diminishing resources. The implication is that there's going to be much more demand on hitherto recipient countries mobilizing their own domestic resources. And I think there will also be an imperative to begin to ask the private sector to come to the party. But we'll get back to the instrumentation in terms of what kind of financial instruments are then appropriate. The financial, in fact, the next bullet tells you, if you're bringing the private sector to the party, the rules are not the same as public money. And I think public money can be leveraged by blending it with private money to mitigate risk as well as to enhance returns that the private sector is looking for. The different players that we've already been told about give rise to what has already been a challenging issue of governance, what I've called complex accountability geometry. Because again, the assumptions, the reasons why the different parties are coming to the party, so to speak, are not the same. And we have to find a new way of talking to each other, understanding where each other is coming from, understanding even the legitimacy of why those different parties are coming to join the party. In terms of resource prioritization, some of you might recognize that I've taken poetic license and removed the country name. I'm sure you recognize that in terms of the economic hitmen. Yeah, if they are going to burn our flag and demonstrate against our embassy, why don't we just get out of their damn country and let them wallow in their own poverty? Why do countries that are involved as partners in development financing keep going? There is a reason. Humanitarian, human rights issues, and then I do not dismiss the fact that there is genuinely what I've called pure development assistance somewhere in the mix. But I think we need to be aware because, again, the geometry is going to be driven by what the intent is. And as you sit at the table and try to negotiate that space, you have to take account of that. Who are the development partners who are changing the game? In the last 5 years, I've not been to an investment conference where China has not been brought up as an issue, especially by Westerners, yeah? Unsurprisingly. Then, of course, we've got state versus non-state players. What is their motivation? How do you hold them accountable? Who, in fact, are they accountable to? And what areas do they choose to engage in? The accountability geometry, I think it's really going to get quite messy. Already we are struggling. You know, there is the concept of the Paris, Accra, and Busan agreements, where there's supposed to be ownership, mutual accountability, and predictability. We're struggling with those things with the few players, traditional players that we already have. As we go forward and bring in the newer, both state and non-state players, this particular geometry is just going to become like a nightmare. And I think we need to discuss what the implications are. Then I touch on the issue of, and I think it's something that we should discuss, it comes up all the time, the nation state. Is it still relevant? Or, put it another way, our aspirations in terms of the world as we would like it to be, the globalized world, are these possible for as long as the concept of a nation state persists, where a politician is elected by particular citizens, a subset, and you're trying to ask country B to almost like the citizen. Again, Europe, we don't have to go very far. What is going on in Europe illustrates this particular issue. Globalization and the nation state and self-interest and the interplay between those two things. In terms of response and governance, we just have not yet come up with a smart way of constructing global governance institutions. And I think the four areas I've highlighted there, the environment, the economy, global economy, security, as 9/11 illustrated, and the whole human rights as a global value system. If we cannot come up with that geometry, we're not going to be able to successfully execute in these dimensions. So governance structures. And then I think what is also interesting for me, the concept of democracy at a national level and the implications of citizens of a country having democracy, but also having a say in across boundaries where what's implied is undemocratic interference, if you like, is something again I think we can debate. I argue that logically capitalism is about competition. On the one hand, people sitting in this room by and large, they mean well, they want to create a world which you can recognize as you travel across the globe and so on, but you come from nations that at the very same time are trying to compete with my country. Now, why should I believe that you really want to help my country get to the same level as you are and then become a much stronger competitor to you? Is that naive on my part? Let's again explore. The global versus, on this slide, I just want you to focus on the last bullet. I've had in the last week a couple of conversations which, and in fact, Sri, you referred to this. You made a comment earlier in your opening statement about if you help a poor country, you are helping its poor citizens. I actually disagree. I think, and again my African experience says, that's not the case. In Africa, we get a lot of governments that get a lot of resources, and it absolutely does not flow down to the people that it's meant for. So when you're helping an administration, it does not follow that you're actually helping the poor people in that country. The converse problem that arises from this is what happened in Malawi with this country, and what I gather is happening in Rwanda with the donor community. So when an administration fails to deliver on perceived understandings and you withdraw support, who are you withdrawing it from? The administration or the people? Should we be coming up with a smarter geography or geometry which allows you to bypass the administration and continue to support the people or not? And what would that look like? In conclusion, I think that resource prioritization is likely to, in my opinion, again subject for debate, to prioritize development assistance at the bottom of that list. In other words, selfish interests will take higher priority than genuine wishes to assist. So foreign policy, human rights, humanitarian, because disaster interventions, those will continue to happen. But I'm arguing and suggesting that we might find that genuine development engagement will be pushed further down the line because of resource constraints. I think it also makes it harder to deliver on these good aspirational asks or agreements that we've entered into in terms of ownership, accountability, and predictability. The new players and the architecture that we need, when we get entities that are not accountable to the citizens, and you're putting them in a mix with citizens who are paying tax and holding their governments accountable, what is that going to look like? When we're getting the private sector and the blended products that I started talking about, what does the governance look like? Again, I think we need to just think through what that means. The higher call on domestic mobilization, here is a possible scenario. Again, I'm using an African perspective. Typically, in African countries where the institutional framework is not in place, there is collusion between the politicians and business people. And that collusion takes the form of value exchange between those two groups of people without going through the formal institutional framework, which means taxes that should be paid to the states do not get paid because individuals benefit. So this and the domestic mobilization of resources actually puts these two groups of people in very close proximity to each other in terms of making that happen. I think that, in fact, therefore, we could see further erosion of institutional formation. That institutions in countries that I come from, like where I come from, instead of us making progress in the formation of institutions, the collusion between these two groups will undermine further the institutionalization in these areas. And I think, therefore, what follows is a further retreat into much more informal, retreat of the formal economy into informality. And that will lead to possibly increases in unemployment and unrest. This is a possible scenario. Thank you very much.